Hello. So this session, we're going to be staying on the perfection of patience. So before we start, let's uh, uh, consider motivation for taking part and using this time to think carefully about how we want to do our best to see an opportunity for change in ourselves, to see what we can do to use any thoughts or inspiration from this to inspire ourselves to sort of learn from or to engage in a practice that will help us become better people, or indeed help us in our journey to enlightenment. So, um, last session we started off looking primarily about what patience um, is about and how it responds to um, or how it corresponds to various aspects of removing our malice. And I asked a question which I'm not sure I really answered very well, concerning the distinction between the perfection uh, um, of ethical discipline, especially in light of removing malice, and then also in the perfection of patience. So hopefully, maybe you have your own thoughts on this, and but what I sort of came to was really that one of the distinctions is that patience, especially within the aspect of the engaged bodhisattva path, where we're continually working with sentient beings, with people, other beings, um, is to think very much about providing ourselves with um, a sort of armor protection, um, and a courage. So this courage primarily is to allow ourselves to remain strong and remain resilient, keep ourselves empowered, regardless of the interactions that we have with others, or with the world in general. So one of the ways in which, for instance, within the perfection of ethical discipline, that we could avoid malice is by avoiding people, avoiding interactions with other beings, and those make it easier for us to sort of not feel malice, right? But the point here is because we're engaged as bodhisattvas, we actually need to be involved in the world, and we need to be involved with the world potentially for a very, very long time. After all, once we've decided to walk the bodhisattva path, the path to Buddhahood, um, then this is for all time. So it's the non-returnable sort of vow that we've made that is doesn't cease after death. Even if we believe in rebirth, we remain working towards Buddhahood for all future lifetimes. So therefore, because of that, we need to have this very, very strong sense of ability to meet difficult situations, difficult people, untrained minds, mainly, and most beings have an untrained mind completely, and are completely lost according to their ability to mitigate the pain they cause, both themselves and others. So for us to be able to work in this environment where we're trying to do our best to inspire and to assist beings who are yet to be trained, obviously ourselves, we need to train. We have to train ourselves first. And likewise, we need to be able to be resilient. So this is a beautiful image we find of Buddha in his final sitting under the Bodhi tree in his final days as a normal person, about to be realize Buddhahood, with all of the great demons, the Maras as they're called, sort of prodding him with with spears and arrows and so on, sort of trying to push his buttons, right? So this sort of ability for him to be resilient, to be strong, and undaunted by these button pushings going on, is very much a part of his sustaining this patience, right? So again, we're seeing is a correspondent action that's related to the corresponding result. It also lends itself in terms of our understanding of emptiness. If we are aware of the composite, non-objective nature and impermanent nature of beings, then we sort of are able to recognize that the idea of saying, you're hurting me and you are hurting me. In other words, the allocation of blame and the allocation of the sufferer in this case, or the person who's being hurt, is very much belongs to a sort of a fabricated sense of true existence. We're not denying that I'm here, or that the people are there, or that they've done these things. What we're trying to say is that but at a deeper level, these things don't really work that way. So we can still imagine them in terms of communications and working with that, but in terms of being legitimate objects for harm causing and so on, things are much more complex. And I think Rinpoche is going to go on to talk about that somehow. So again, remembering that primarily we're working on this cherishing mind, this cherishing loving kindness, and also we're working on this emptiness, these two great big bodhicittas that drive us forward into Buddhahood, then the bodhicitta of this cherishing, loving mind towards all beings without exception. And then again, and the sense of responsibility for all beings that we've adopted, and then an insight into the nature of reality. These two together are the bodhicitta that we are holding. So this is often called the compassionate side is called the relative bodhicitta, and the wisdom side is called the ultimate bodhicitta. And together they make the wish fulfilling gem of bodhicitta that provides us with a path to lasting happiness, not just for ourselves but for all beings. Now, it might be that you think of Bhagavad from an academic position, or from a historic position, or from a literary position, that the Mahayana arose around the 1st century AD. And in terms of some of the sutras and the sources of the sutras, it does definitely seem that we're looking around the turn of this sort of period when we're beginning to see these sutras appearing. But remember that Buddha himself was recognized as a bodhisattva. So the idea of infinite compassion was built into the very, very earliest of Buddha's teaching. The point about and the vow to become a Buddha, the vow of a bodhisattva, was also mentioned in the Pali and in the early Buddhist teachings, because Buddha himself was this. So anything to do with Buddha's lifetime was, in many ways, is indeed a Mahayana sutra. Yeah. So in this sort of sense, if we actually recognize that although Buddha didn't teach very much about his own path in terms of being a bodhisattva, he showed us how to be a Buddha, and he showed us that the path to Buddhahood was available to us. So these two things essentially is that although there may have been less words mentioned in terms of the Pali section, Pali sutras and Pali texts, then certainly in terms of the way in which Pali recorded and talked about Buddha, is no doubt that in fact is a legitimate historical source to the Mahayana, even in the earliest sources, right? So don't be misled into thinking it's some sort of something new. In fact, this is very, very well established in the most ancient of traditions. So yeah, there's a little difference in terms of the idea of how a Buddha ends, in terms of it's the Buddha's final state, and that does change between the Mahayana and the Theravada tradition. But in terms of the path, and in terms of the availability of the path, then there is much less difference than it might at first appear. So one of the aspects of this, and I've said this before, is that with a Buddha, from a Mahayana perspective, from Mahayana traditions, we believe that Buddha continues to liberate all sentient beings as a Buddha beyond death or beyond parinirvana, whereas the Theravada tradition feel that actually it is only during his life that he is able to teach, and he is able to teach Buddhism, and only he is able to teach Buddhism where it has not been taught before. So one of the aspects of this is we know that anybody who claims to be Maitreya Buddha, for instance, today, the next Buddha, the future Buddha arising, cannot be yet a Maitreya Buddha because we haven't yet forgotten the teachings of Shakyamuni, the current Buddha. So therefore we know that we have to wait until Buddha's teaching has been completely forgotten before the next Buddha, if you like, can arise. That's in terms of this universe. There are other places where Buddhas can arise, and in one sense one can argue one can achieve Buddhahood without having to wait for the ability to exhibit this special quality of being able to teach where there is no teaching left. So one of the aspects of that is then within, when we're looking at that in terms of the where we stand as bodhisattvas, or attempting to be bodhisattvas, I should say, or working towards becoming bodhisattvas, is that our future lives, no matter how many future lives, regardless of how many future lives there are, we are working towards benefiting all sentient beings. So during that time, what we're doing is similar in nature to a resultant Buddha. Where still, we're not different from a Buddha in terms of our compassion, our giving of fearlessness, our giving of happiness, our providing of patience. All of these aspects, our self-discipline, all of these different aspects that are part of the Bodhisattva path are similar to and congruent with the final nature of Buddhahood. Therefore, in a sense, we are engaging in enlightening behavior, the ability to enlighten ourselves and others is ceaselessly into the future. So then the variation of when or whether or not we're going to become a Buddha this life or next life or in future lives, it really doesn't matter. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to carry on developing ourselves and doing the best we can for all beings. Eventually maybe we become a Buddha. So and probably, so in this sense, if we understand that, then it's like, okay, well, whatever I'm able to do, that's fantastic. So it's not necessarily too easy to become a Buddha, but that also doesn't mean that we have any reason to give up. Whatever we do, however much we're able to do in this life, right now, using the moments that we have, is of extremely great value to all beings, as long as we put ourselves into the line of thinking, I want to work for all beings, not just for myself or just for my family or whatever. So when we've actually developed that mind, when we've actually managed to achieve this impartial mind of great compassion, of great love, of recognizing all sentient beings as valid objects of our love and our compassion, then even at that point, even for that at that moment, from that moment, in many ways our life becomes fulfilled, right? So everything else we can able to do that's in line with that thought is of huge value to all beings. How we do that, how we express that, and how we're able to do that, these are things that will arise in terms of our abilities or our understanding. So we do need to have some wisdom, we do need to have some insight, otherwise we can make huge mistakes and cause huge much damage. But at the same time, so with this wisdom, with this understanding, and also with this loving kindness, we're able to do great things. So Je Rinpoche says here, what we're doing is we're looking at the divisions of patience, and he mentioned this before earlier on. He's going to now go into some more detail on these. One of them is disregarding harm done to us. One is accepting suffering, and another one is the certitude of the teaching. So we mentioned those before. So this particular week, we're going to be working on the first of those. I think that's all we'll have time for in this session. So this is where we're working on disregarding the harm that's done to us. So he then is going to split this into two further divisions. One of them, which is to prevent our impatience with those who harm us, and the other one is also to prevent us from disliking the achievements or attainments of those who've caused us harm or cause us harm or might cause us harm, and also likewise to delight in their trouble. So delight in their troubles, or also, or if you like, laugh at their suffering, or feel like, well, they deserve that. So this sort of mind of yeah, well, they got what for you, that's a good thing. That's what we have to avoid. This is all part of patience, is actually remaining and sustaining our compassion for all beings without exception. So in this particular case, what we need to do is to work on developing a strong um, um, uh, uh, empowered mind that is not going to be swayed by others, right? All others. So if we've determined to do this, what we need to think about is saying, if anything, it becomes an obstruction to my loving kindness or to my compassion, then it's going to disempower my conviction. It's going to be make me a bit of a fraud because I'm saying, oh yeah, I want to work for all sentient beings, and it's like, yeah, but I'm not, am I? Because I was annoyed with that guy for what, or that person, or that organization for what they did there, and yeah, they deserve what they got. This is completely mistaken, right? So let's look at this into a bit more detail, right? So starting again with the first of those those two divisions of preventing impatience with those who harm others, and again, Je Rinpoche has divided this into two. Those in terms of those who prevent our happiness or cause me to suffer, and also those who prevent our praise or our fame or our honor, and or have contempt for us, right? So again, this whole point is going to be looking at saying, for those who would harm us or who would belittle us or put us down, these things we need to be able to deal with, especially and also if they are saying something offensive or they're spreading rumors about us. All of these things we need to sustain our sense of love and affection. So on the first one, which is to do with preventing happiness of those who would cause us suffer or causing suffer, or we're concerned about them causing suffer, in this sense, what we're going to now do is to look at a whole set of meditations to help us accommodate and understand the irrelevance and also the mistake of feeling justified for our fury, or to feel that in this particular case, I've got every right to feel this way, on the basis of our path. So these are really going to be looking at, well, I'll go through this in a minute. But what we're going to do is we need to think in terms of ourselves that if we allow our buttons to be pushed, this is one way of looking at it. If we allow our buttons to be pushed externally, then we are losing control over ourselves. And in a sense, we're allowing our aggressors to get to us, right? Similar to Buddha, if Mara was able to distract Buddha by poking him with a rod when he was sitting under the tree, he wouldn't have become a Buddha. So similarly, what we're saying is essentially we've got to be brave. We've got to be willing to and able to bear the pain of this, bear the sort of the pain or the shame or the issues with this without feeling shaken. So what we're trying to work on here is this an unshakable strength. Right, patience is often thought about as being a sort of, a weak way where you're just being passive, you're allowing people to sort of walk over you, and in fact the opposite is the case. What we're looking for is a strength, an incredible resilience to allowing ourselves to sustain our mind regardless of what happens around us. So one of the aspects of this, and I am going to carry on a bit longer, even though this is a long session, is when we're looking at patience, what we're looking at is the quality of our mind. We're looking at the way in which we actually mentally or emotionally respond to a stimulus or a fear or potential stimulus, right? So it might be that we have a suspicion that somebody's doing something and we react quite violently to it, even if we're not really sure that there's anything happening. But even if somebody does and we see evidence that they're doing something wrong, then this rage comes in us. And at that point, we have lost our mind. We've lost our ability to sustain our mind. So in a sense, they've won. It might not be what they wanted to do, but essentially, regardless, is that as soon as they've allowed us to be to feel furious, they've broken us, right? So we've got to work on the idea of saying that we're looking at strength in terms of being able to, in our mind, in terms of being able to sustain this loving kindness and this compassion. In terms of our responses, in terms of the actual what we say and what we do, is that actually relevant? And the question and the answer is something to really think about very carefully is if I feel that there is an opportunity here for training, such as somebody is saying something, and if they continue to do this to others, it's going to cause trouble for them, then being a little bit sharp or being a little bit setting a strong boundary or making it clear to them that what they're doing is a mistake is not impatient as long as our mind is filled with love and compassion for them. However, if we have any doubt whatsoever that in fact we're just using this as an excuse to punish them, then we should not punish them. We need to be really 100% clear that our actions are based upon loving kindness and compassion. If there's even a slight doubt in our minds at all, even like that there could be an unconscious or subconscious or a tweak or a twist of wishing to punish, then we cannot do that. So we have to be very, very aware of ourselves because we tend to be tricky this way, right? When we look at ourselves, we look at our actions, we often justify what we've done. Oh, I did it because of this, this, this. If we're justifying ourselves, the chances are that we know there's something there that underlying there that's not quite right. So one of these aspects here is because we're getting defensive, right? Why are we getting defensive? Because we think there's a part of us that's judging us against that. So then on this other aspect is to say, so for instance, if we think about it and we're able to do this, then we can act according to what is most necessary for the other beings. And this is actually what we should be doing. So acting in accordance to what is most necessary, the most benefit to all beings, is always going to be what should dictate our actions. Yet, if we are unsure that this really is our motive, then we need to step aside and be peaceful. So the strength of mind in terms of tolerance, in terms of patience and tolerance, is always based upon sustaining our loving kindness, our compassion, our wisdom, our practice, right? Sustaining our practice as bodhisattvas. So in terms of the bodhisattva, we're wearing this armor of resilience. And yet, if we if we're able to sustain that armor of resilience, and as long as our actions are what benefits most, then whether or not they appear violent or they appear sharp is not related to our patience. So the idea that we have to always be soft is not correct. Sometimes we need to be hard, as long as we're not going to lose our resilience inside, our loving kindness and compassion. But here, and what Je Rinpoche is concentrating on, almost entirely is the mind, not our response, the way in which our mind works. And he's saying there's no reason whatsoever to allow our mind to degrade into malice or to fall from our to fall from our armor of patience and tolerance, right? This is what we must sustain. We mustn't let our buttons be pushed. So Je Rinpoche says, okay, let's do in a way, these are creative. They're creative approaches to working with preventing us or for providing us with insight into why our fury, our retaliation, specifically this is about retaliation in this particular context, or we'll go into the other ones later, why retaliation is completely unjustified. So this retaliatory mind, this mind that wishes to retaliate or to punish or to hurt because they hurt me, right? So when we start, a really good thing to start on is to say, um, uh, open and be honest to ourselves. There's no point in us lying to ourselves. Nobody else can see our minds in this particular case. So what we're looking is to say, well, what grounds do I have to be angry towards those who would harm me or those who do harm me, right? When is it right for me to punish them, right? So we might think, and this is, he says, we might think, well, they first had the wish to harm me. They then gathered all the things that were necessary to harm me, and then they, either they prevented my happiness, they took something that that they knew I wanted, or they inflicted unpleasant physical, mental suffering onto me, and they caused all sorts of problems for me, right? So, they deserve a bit of what for? I'm a practitioner, I'm a bodhisattva. What they're doing is disregarding my bodhisattva state. This is outrageous behavior. They need to be punished, right? So then Jeremy says, okay, well, fair enough. Are you angry because when they were inflicting harm, they had self-control? Or are you, um, in other words, they but they had the self-control not to harm us, and yet they harmed us? Or are you angry with them because they had no self-control, because they're without any self-control, and they just hurt us helplessly? And he says, okay, if we look at these two, then it's like saying, okay, well, so they had they had the opportunity, they're practitioners, they had the ability to self-control, and they failed. And quite clearly they failed. Therefore, we recognize that, in fact, although they may be training, they may be in training, at this moment they failed because it's not in their interest to harm others, right? Just as it's not in our interest to harm others. So either they are affected by a lack of control over their understanding of over their malice, or alternatively, they have a wrong view, okay, a faulty view that thinks it's okay to harm. In both cases, they have no control. They've lost control. They've lost control over their abilities. They're filled with these afflictions. So in that sense, it's like saying, okay, there is no control there, right? And even if they have a huge amount more control than yourself, it might be that essentially they get caught up in a moment, and they become less mindful in that particular case. And then it's not as if they're thinking, oh, I'm going to be angry with Ben or whatever, right? They're not thinking it like, oh, I'm going to be angry with him. This is something that naturally comes out. It's like, you need like that, right? And then it's like afterwards, then they might think, oh, maybe that was a bit harsh, right? But then maybe they're a bit too proud to say that to us, right? So then they're going to be like, okay, and we're like, yeah, that's horrible, and then we do it back. So what he's saying is essentially, at this particular case, then these people even if they have in general great self-control, at this point they do not. They're like become servants to their afflictions. They become completely compelled by their afflictions, by their malice that's suddenly arisen, or their lack of correct view, and this has led to their destructive behavior, right? And then he says, okay, and also in the latter case, where you actually have somebody, we're angry because a humgo has completely no self-control whatsoever, or not interested in self-control, they're just completely wild, then why is our anger justified? It's not as if they've had any control. So when we think, okay, well, they did that, they did that deliberately. It's like if they did it deliberately, then from their point of view, from our point of view, their minds, they're being ruled by their afflictions. They're being ruled by this angry mind. For us to recognize that actually this fury is damaging both for themselves and for others, is like to say, okay, well, actually, maybe the subject of my fury should definitely be the fury in them, the afflictions, not the person, right? The person is being subject to that fury. They're not in control of their fury, right? They don't understand their fury, or they're not in control of it. So likewise, it's like saying, for instance, taking Aryadeva's 400 verses, he says, when a doctor doesn't fight but helps a person who is deeply mentally ill. So sometimes when we're mentally ill, we might lash out at those who would help us. And at this point, it's like saying, even though these people are lashing out and they're being furious or whatever, when we understand that they're essentially mentally ill, then we don't feel like we need to punish them back. We need to be compassionate and kind and understand them and do what we can to help them. So he says again, it's like this is how we can look at this, is to recognize that it's the afflictions which are at fault, not the people who have those afflictions. It's interesting in terms of Asian languages like Tibetan and Sanskrit and so on. We there they sort of say, "I have anger. I'm sort of anger has arisen." So in a sense, there's the idea of saying that. It's a property that has arisen, or it's something that is to be held or owned. But in in English, for instance, we say I am angry, and there's this sense of identity. I'm identifying with this anger. And yet, of course, what this means is that we find it harder to differentiate between the idea that the anger is this unfortunate arising in our mind, to the idea that in fact this is who I am, this identifies me, this is a part of who I am, and therefore why should I let it go? And we find this in meditation, especially with beginners in meditation, is this idea of saying these thoughts that are going through my mind are the ones that I have. They're my thoughts, and therefore that's what I think. And when we meditate, after a while, we see that all sorts of thoughts arise without us sort of needing to own them at all. They just arise naturally, and they can be all sorts of wacky things that we wouldn't agree with whatsoever. So the idea of saying, oh yeah, this anger is mine, therefore it's sort of justified, doesn't make any sense when we actually recognize that in fact this anger arises in our mind and we need to address that separately. So again, Je Rinpoche says, citing Chandrakirti, it's not the being's fault, rather it is the fault of the afflictions the being has. So we need to analyze that, recognize that, and then not fight with others. And then, of course, Je Rinpoche cites, he actually doesn't cite, but he mentions that Shantideva's text has many, many other examples of this as well. So when he also says that essentially the bodhisattva levels, another text, Asanga, says that when we meditate on the idea of mere phenomena, in other words, when we recognize that things are not as they appear to be, that they are empty of this objective self-existence, then when we meditate on this, then this helps us to bear harm and also to recognize the interdependence of all things. So I think, talking of which, I think this is what he's going to go on to talk about later on. And he says, Je Rinpoche says, and we can recognize this, is that if these beings had self-control, then they wouldn't have any suffering, because they'd be free, because they would see or recognize that the causes of suffering, such as the afflictions, and having recognized the causes of these afflictions, they wouldn't wish to engage in them, right? And Jeremy Schrein makes another point, which is if we think these beings, sentient beings in general, but maybe these particular beings I'm dealing with, when they could be so moved by these strong afflictions, these strong minds, that sometimes they commit suicide, they leap from cliffs, harm themselves, self-harm of all sorts. They might cut themselves or poison themselves or stop eating, punishing themselves in all sorts of ways, self-harm in all sorts of different ways. And if they're going to do this to their cherished selves, of course they'll hurt others too. But to think that they're doing this with some sort of degree of understanding of what they're doing, a true understanding of what they're doing is obviously a mistake. So yes, and here Rinpoche says, Je Rinpoche says in Shantideva, and everything is dependent on something else. And because everything is dependent, it's not autonomous. It doesn't stand alone, right? Understanding this, it is a mistake for us to be angry at anything, but as all beings are like illusions. Now, being like illusions doesn't mean that they don't feel harm and don't feel suffering. So we must be aware of the fact that it's not saying that all beings are illusions. They're saying it's like illusions in terms of the fact that we imbue upon them something that isn't there. And what we imbue upon them that isn't there is this idea of this objective self-existence. So the idea that they're standalone, that they're independent. We know that they are impermanent, we are changing from moment to moment, but we don't think of it that way. The person who shouted at me yesterday isn't the same person as today, right? It's a whole day's gone by. So all of these ways in which we are thinking creatively about this way to help us to break down or to begin to feel the irrelevance or the meaninglessness of us being angry towards an aggressor. And then also citing Shedstave, he says, therefore, if you see an enemy or a friend who doing something that is wrong or harmful to us, then to think, this arises from certain conditions and for us to remain happy. So to recognize these arising from conditions, um, and therefore I don't need to think that this is something that I need to feel any reason to be aggressive towards them. And he says, remember, if everybody could achieve whatever they wanted according to their wish, then since nobody wants suffering, nobody would suffer. So this is the point of saying is that we know that people have confused minds. I mean, this is essentially the basis of our compassion, is to recognize suffering in all beings and recognize the cause of suffering in all beings, and how all beings, except for those who are enlightened, fully enlightened, are caught up in this great cycle of samsara, this great cycle of the sort of wheel of convictions, which just keeps us confused and down and unhappy and striving for things that are unattainable for us. So then he says also we can look at it in terms of inherency or adventitiousness is the word they have here. He says that in this way, what we're doing is we're looking and saying it either is the nature the harming others, right? Is either in the nature of sentient beings or it's not in the nature of sentient beings. So we're using sort of the idea is to use some simple logic to examine this thing, right? He said if it is in their nature to cause suffering, then, well, it's just wrong for us to be angry at it. It would be like us being angry at fire for being hot, right? Yet, and if you say, okay, well, if it's actually um, um, If it's not in their nature, then it's like it's something that's happening to them. It's separate from them. Then it's wrong to be angry, because it's sort of like the same as being angry at the sky because there's smoke in it. So we have this fire and all this smoke going into the air. This is the anger, right? And then why are we getting angry with the sky? Because there's smoke in it, right? So the idea is saying, if it is part of this, if it is part of the other being, then why be angry? Because it's in their nature. If it's separate from their nature, then why are we getting angry at them? Because it's separate. So this is another way in which we can think it doesn't make any sense for us to be angry at somebody like this. So again, another way, and these are really useful ways of us trying to see how mistaken it is for us to get angry in these cases. So he says again, is the harm direct or indirect? Regardless, it's unjustified. So this is okay. We're talking about the agent of harm, right? So if we are angry at the agent of harm, in other words, that which inflicts the harm, then we should be angry at the stick, right? Not the stick holder. I mean, this is like if we're being beaten with a stick, yeah? So the idea is saying we're being beaten by a stick, and therefore the that which is actually directly creating the harm is the stick, not the person holding it, right? That's what's hitting us. So in that sense, we should be angry at the stick. So it says, okay, well then you should say, well, I want to be angry at the harm doer who indirectly is inflicting the harm. In other words, the stick holder is the one who seems to be the causative agent. He says, well, if you say that, then of course you must also recognize, in fact, the harm doer is the affliction of fury or anger that the person is an agent of. Right? So it's like saying, for us to recognize the causal chain between the stick holder and the stick, and say, okay, well, it's the stick holder. If we want to apply that, and we must also apply it to the next level, which is it's the affliction of fury, this affliction of anger or malice that they are holding, which is causing them to hit us with a stick. Therefore, again, we need to be angry at the hostility. I'll go into what that actually means later on. So, and again, Shantideva says, the stick and so forth directly cause the harm, but if I am angry at the one who throws it or hits or holds it, then since it's hostility that impels them, it is far better for me to be angry at hostility. So when we begin to recognize that actually this causal sequence of how harm making happens, then in the end we're saying that if there is any intentional any intention to cause harm, this is malice. This is actually the definition of malice in one sense, is that which intends to cause harm. So our enemy is not the person who's subjected to that affliction. Our enemy is that intention, that intentional mind. Malice is our enemy, and malice, and this is what Shantideva was saying, is malice is the only real the only legitimate object of our malice, right? Is to recognize, okay, so that harm is done. So how do we respond? So again, he says, if we look at the cause that impels harm to us, anger is unjustified. So here is saying is that essentially we've got to recognize that we're involved in a cycle of suffering. So part of this is to say, well, actually, where is this malice arisen from within their mind? It's arisen because we're all in this interdependent circle of samsara. And sometimes we have very little control over what we do, but also in terms of the way in which we are living our lives, these things arise because of external stimuluses. So in this sort of sense, the point about this is that we are caught up in this cycle of suffering and reciprocal suffering, right? So if we allow for fury to generate fury, if we allow for malice to generate malice, we are closing that circle. We are sustaining that circle of malice. If we can recognize that, in fact, the only response to malice is non-malice, we are able to break that chain and prevent it from being able to continue. So this primarily is the only way in which we can actually begin to help the universe. If we are still involved, for instance, in a cycle of killing, if we're in part of the involved in the cycle of killing, then uh, uh, we are legitimizing killing. If we're involved in the cycle of malice or harm making, or harm intention, then and we respond in kind, then we are continuing to sustain that cycle of harm and harm making. So recognizing how damaging harm can be and harmfulness can be, which is what we were talking about last session, is it's clear that, in fact, as soon as harm arises, this is the only point that we have available to us to actually demonstrate our patience, right? So our resilience and our non-harm that is primarily is going to be, most of the time, is going to be our intention to cause harm is most often driven by external stimuluses, which are going to be like pushing our buttons. So in this sense, what we're looking at is saying, no, this is not right for me to continue with this cycle. And in many ways, what we're saying is while I am engaging in a cycle of harm, so when I feel able to that it's okay for me to reciprocate by in kind, in terms of harmful means harmful. This is like an eye for eye or tooth for tooth. This similar idea of saying they did it, so I can do it back. This cycle of suffering, we become a cause of suffering for everybody. We remain bound into that cycle of suffering for everybody, including ourselves. So therefore, we're legitimizing their behavior. We're saying it's okay to harm me, and we completely lose our scope, our journey in that action. Again, so in terms of us, subject of the analysis of the subject, anger is unjustified. So he says here, and this is going back to just what I was saying a bit in a different way, slightly a different angle perspective. He says if we allow ourselves to get angry at the harm doer because of an inability to bear the suffering that they've caused us or they are causing us, then this is sort of contradictory, because even while we're unable to deal with this slight harm that they might be causing us, we are creating and we're continuing to create conditions for us to experience more suffering, more pain by our aspects of malice. So in this sense, we're keeping ourselves locked in this cycle of reciprocated violence or reciprocated harm. So when we think this way, we should think sort of when we feel this arising, Jeremy Boucher suggests that we should try to induce a sense of embarrassment and think, I'm actually really very stupid at this, and do what we can to actually reconsider our anger and find ways to dissolve it, to evaporate it, to see how foolish it is. So another way of looking at that is to say that when we are given the opportunity to restrain from, to restrain from, or to sustain our loving kindness in the points of pain and the points of this suffering, then this is when we're really working. This is when we're actually making a substantial difference to the universe. And this is because essentially it's not like some sort of mystical stuff or whatever. The idea is remembering that whatever we do, whatever actions we do, they burn themselves into history, into universal history. There's no undoing, there's no rewind, right? So when we do this, we have these cultural, these psychological, these physical, these mental, all of these different effects. And we've talked about this two semesters ago. So all of these different ways in which karma, this action generates consequences. So all of these sort of different psychological, social, cultural ways in which a single action bears consequences. And when we close off an opportunity for fury by accepting it, by meeting it without generating fury on our side, then that diminishes the future chance for that fury, for fury at all, and harmfulness to sustain in across all of these different consequences, all of these different sources. So because of that, what that allows us to do is to actually practice. This is our practice. This is where we begin to turn away from sustaining this samsaric cycle. When we're not being subjected to insults or suffering or to these sorts of things, it's much easier for us to sustain non-malice because there's no trigger for it. There's no buttons being pushed. And so in that sense, our actions are relatively neutral. They don't have as much consequence to them because there's no stimulus that is providing us opportunity to make a mistake. This vigilance, this ability for us to be able to use these opportunities to demonstrate our non-fury, to demonstrate our non-anger, to demonstrate, in fact, the opposite, our loving kindness and compassion, is incredibly valuable to us. And in this way, Je Rinpoche says, we need to really say, thank you very much for this. This is a wonderful opportunity. Maybe not actually say it to the person. They might think, okay, I'll just hit you some more. Which is not the idea. The idea is to say, okay, I can recognize this great opportunity and be grateful inside. So it says essentially, this ability for me to help make a difference to the universe. Why should I not be? Why should I be impatient with this person who's actually providing me with this opportunity to make a difference in the world, right? So this thing is we're actually able to, if you like, help to distinguish the ongoing consequences. And this makes a huge difference. People are very influenced by this. It has a huge difference on our world. So this is in terms of intentional harm, but there's also unintentional harm, and it's exactly the same. Essentially, unintentional harm, in fact, even harm caused by non-intentional beings or objects, such as, for instance, illness or from weather, let's say. None of these are correct sources of button pushing. It's not right for us to be furious with the weather or to feel harmed by, to feel annoyed with the weather or to feel, uh, 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 you know, wanting to put that rain away. Or likewise with disease, is for us to not feel furious at the disease. This doesn't help us. The object is not available to us for our fury. All we're doing is we're harming ourselves. We're harming our mind, our mindfulness. And we are completely powerless to be able to do anything about it. but being furious is far more likely to cause us damage than any good, not in terms of just our practice, but also in terms of our presence of mind and our ability to deal with it. So in general, when we are this idea of armor, this sort of being brave and courageous, is also to do with any forms of harm or sense of suffering. Again, it's like saying, I need to be able to bear suffering in any form, not just from those who would attack me. And likewise, to develop a sense of awareness that suffering is part of our lives. It's going to happen, and without us, if we begin to fear suffering, if we begin to retreat from suffering, this fear, this basic fear, leads to aversion, and aversion leads to malice. It's sort of the idea is to say that I don't want to allow myself to be governed this way, my mind to be governed by these external stimuluses. Now, developing a very strong resilience of extreme suffering is extremely hard, and it's not something that is easily learnt. And so if we're able to even do something that's very, very simple, very small, then that's a major benefit. There are huge amounts of benefits within this life for ourselves for being able to do that. One of them is that as we go older, we become more and more dependent upon others, and we're going to be finding it harder and harder and harder to understand the situation that we're in, especially if we get to be advanced age. And in that position, if we're working on developing patience and working on developing this courage and this brave attitude towards suffering, both that which is caused from intention, but also that which just arises from our age, for instance, then our ability to sustain an understanding and courage and calm will really help us in our old age. Moreover, if we've also working on our loving kindness and our compassion, then people who we meet who will be looking after us in these situations will be happy to look after us. They'll find it very, very easy. And although they're meant to be impartial, in the end, generally, it's much easier to look after somebody who seems to be content, kind, and appreciative of you than somebody who's furious, angry, shouting, and miserable. So there are these sorts of things really benefit everybody who will come in touch with us. This is if we're fortunate enough to live that whole. So again, he also says on the analysis of the basis, anger is unjustified. So if we think about in terms of, somebody sticking me with a knife, right, a shank or whatever, and they stick it to me, then it's like saying, both the shank and my body are causes of suffering. She got the shank and I got the body. So why should I be angry at him when it is me who got this body, right? So this idea here is based on the idea that because we're caught in samsara, that our bodies are, there's nothing special about them. There's sort of like an agglomeration of sort of muddy bits and pieces that somehow manage to work, even within a sort of modern biological point of view. In the end, it's just made up of sort of bits and pieces. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily mud, but the point is essentially that uh, uh, the idea of saying, if I have a body that is prone to harm, then it is going to cause harm for me. Why should I be angry if something harms me this way? So then another point about this is to thinking about it in terms of our commitment, which I've sort of also been mentioning too. So it says it doesn't matter which sort of Buddhist we are. It doesn't matter if we're Theravadins or if we're Bodhisattvas or we're Prachekas or any of the different types of Buddhism there is. In all cases, it's like there's no right for us to be impatient or to get angry. right? Even more so if we're engaged in the Bodhisattva path, if we're engaged with all beings, recognizing that they're going to fling out at us because they're untrained or because they're deviating from their path or for whatever reason, for us to recognize and to work, we're working with them, we're trying our best to work with them in order to benefit them, right? For us to feel angry at them because or frustrated with them, this is a gross mistake. And Rinpoche quotes Baudoir here, in case you Baudoir is Tibetan, who says that, if we recognize Buddha's teaching is primarily to make no mistakes, to cause no harm, to be whatever we do is to make sure that it causes no harm. So when we fail to cultivate this patience, we're going to therefore cause harm. Where the idea is we wish to intentionally cause harm. And Baudoir says when we do that, we're sort of essentially cursing the Dharma, saying, this will eradicate the teaching, because the teaching depends upon our practice. In the end, Dharma is not words, Buddha is not words, Buddha is not sutras, Buddha is us working, following the path of Buddha. That's what Buddhahood is. That's what Buddhism really is. In the end, it's a living tradition, not a dry tradition. It is the idea, the transmission of mind of saying, look, yeah, we can do this, we can behave this way. And he says, therefore, when we actually say we want to eradicate this teaching, and we're also basically breaking our vow, we're breaking our bodhisattva vow, we're also breaking our vow as a Buddhist. And it says, therefore, as we don't even have understanding of teaching as a whole, when we drop our patience, we don't even have the small part of understanding that we do have. So this is just a way of looking at it. So then there's this saying, okay, well, this is all good stuff, but what about showing how compassion is actually appropriate in this situation? So he says, and this is when we remember that all beings have been in samsara or remain in samsara since beginning this time, and from a position of rebirth, endless rebirth, then all beings have been a friend, have been a relative, they've been my father or mother. And as I said before, in terms of our modern world, we need to think like all beings are my relative, or even trees are my relative. They're all cousins. They all come from a common root, last universal common ancestor, Luca. And in that sense, we can argue that all beings are my cousin. They're all my brothers and sisters, if you like. But being impermanent, all beings lose their lives, and they're miserable to the three types of suffering, which is we talked about last semester. So crazed by these demons of the afflictions, from these not understanding, this lack of clarity about the nature of reality is leading to this coarse, grasping attachment, as we talked about last semester. The 12 interdependent links. Then they destroy all of these beings destroy our own welfare in this life and also future lives. This is the basis of our compassion, right? So how could it possibly be right to get angry or feel the need to retaliate? Absolutely, how can we do that? This is just then all we are doing is becoming yet another being who's lost in our own, crazed by the demon of our afflictions, and is not relevant to us. So then Jeremiah goes on. He wants to talk about stopping impatience with those who prevent our praise or fame, right? And those who have contempt for us or to say offensive or unpleasant things to us. But before I want to go on there, I want to actually talk about what I said I would briefly about being angry at anger. So in a sense, the idea is here, then it comes from the Shantadeva's quote about saying, if anything, you should be angry at the cause, and cause is anger. So we should feel malice for malice or anger for anger. So it sounds essentially like this is could be a mistake, because malice is the intention to harm, and the intention to harm is a negative state. But when we're talking about something which is essentially an affliction, a wrongdoing by its nature, it's the cause of suffering itself. Any cause of suffering is what we're trying to destroy, right? So the word harming is, in one sense, equivalent to, in this case, is equivalent to the idea of destroying. We're trying to destroy the afflictions. The first place that we need to destroy our afflictions is in ourselves. So when we're getting angry at anger, what we're really saying is, I need to stop being angry, and I need to learn how to do that. This is how to be angry at anger. In other words, being angry at anger is our practice. It's not meaning that we should be furious at anger and sort of tear our hair out and shake our fists or try to hit it with a stick, right? The idea is to recognize that the intention to harm anger really means just to destroy anger itself. So the only way that we can be angry at anger is by removing anger from the equation completely. And likewise, also removing all our other afflictions, such as wrong view, coarse attachment, and so on. So when we're looking at those who would prevent our praise or our fame or our honor, those who would have contempt for us or knock us down socially, and saying things that are unpleasant or offensive. So Jeremshe is going to split this into two groups. Again, this is not really to do with direct harm, or in terms of physical harm, if you like, or the equivalent. Or this is to do with the emotional harm of being disrespected, I guess, is the sort of another way of looking at it now, being dissed. So he says, well, those which are those who prevent our praise, fame, or honor, and then he'll look at that first of all, and then after he'll do the rest. So he says one of the ways, again, these are creative, we can use our own approaches to this, but the idea is to remember that these things are absolutely right for us not to be responding to. So he says, when somebody praises us, or honors us, or wishes to make us famous, or our fame, these things are actually not great for us. They have a tendency for us to develop arrogance or pride, for us to say, oh, aren't I good, right? So as soon as we start doing that, we begin to lose our humility. And humility is important because what we need to do is to remember that who's important is all sentient beings, not us. We're not important at all. The other thing is we depend completely upon our teachers and upon the Dharma and upon Buddha for every single benefit that we're able to get. So it's not like I've done this. This is just primarily what I'm trying to do in order to sustain and to understand the path to Buddhahood. It's not done it's not done by me, and it's not done for me, and I'm absolutely irrelevant to everything. So in this sense, the idea is to say is that it might come naturally that we become famous, or we see praise coming to us, but for us to respond to that as being this is meaningful is a complete mistake on our side. And Jeremshe says, fame and praise doesn't bring us long life. It doesn't bring us health. It doesn't bring us any material benefit particularly. And it doesn't generate merit. It doesn't help us in our future lives or in our abilities that way. So for us to become attached to fame or praise, these things are really primarily non-spiritual aspirations. Then they're completely not relevant to our path. Then we should think, And he says, my displeasure, any sense of displeasure that arises when my praise or my fame is ruined, is no different from when small children cry when their sandcastles collapse, right? And a sandcastle you can't live in a sandcastle. It's just a toy. It's just an idle construct in one sense made by children to play with, right? So there's nothing wrong with it as a plaything. But it doesn't function as a dwelling. It doesn't function as a house, and for it to be destroyed is just to lose one's toy. And likewise, the idea that somehow fame or praise, these things generate anything substantial of value, is like to mourn their loss, is to make the mistake that they actually had any value in the first place. There are several people who are famous who have said, having fought their lives for fame, once they reached fame, they realized that their entire ambition was a waste of time. And again, this is from Shantideva, and he cites the verse from that, which is like, when their sandcastles collapse, children cry in great distress. Likewise, my mind is childish when my praise and fame are ruined. Then he also says that praise and fame and honor and these sorts of things, respect, all these aspects really distract my mind with meaninglessness. They absolutely have no value. They destroy my disenchantment with cyclic existence because I'm beginning to attach myself. So, oh, that's nice. Not recognizing its suffering nature at all. Then I become jealous of those who are more famous than me or have greater respect to me, right? This is just meaningless too. It makes no difference whatsoever to my practice. All that matters is my practice. Many people have said that about Geshe, my teacher. He was not very well known. He wasn't very famous. He didn't have very many students. He had a few, yes, and he had the Buddhist centers, the Lam Rim centers in South Africa and so on. But we were a small community, and he didn't write any books, and he wasn't even very well known in the monasteries, and yet he kept his practice. He kept his practice very, very strong. And towards the end of the life, he said, I've managed to achieve some amazing realizations. So these something like Gulu, right, for those who understand that. So this sort of thing is very, very impressive. And yet he wasn't famous. He didn't get much praise. He was often treated like a normal person, even by his own students, sort of saw him as a normal person. They would talk across him as if he weren't there sometimes. So these sorts of things is like saying, yeah, he might have looked like a very normal person, very very simple person living in a house in Wales, but what's going on inside, that's what really matters. So instead of feeling this sense of fury towards those who are causing us trouble in terms of preventing us from getting the praise or preventing us from getting famous, right? We should be delighted. We should be great. That relieves me of the burden of fame, relieves me of the burden of being honourable, relieves me of the burden of getting lots of medals or a knighthood or whatever, which is then yet more responsibility, yet more stuff that I have to deal with without very much meaning. It helps to cut my attachment to these things, to think about this, like to say, actually, these things are not meaningful. I don't need to be famous. I don't need to be well known. I don't need to have many students. I don't need to have any of these things. I need to just work on my practice. If I'm able to share something that's inspiring to one person or two people, and they're able to it makes a difference in their lives, it doesn't matter if they're Buddhist or not Buddhist, that's not relevant. What's relevant is if I'm able to have an impact which is positive on their lives, all the better. But for me, I need to do my best to think about developing my compassionate mind, working on my understanding of loving kindness for all beings, trying to sustain impartiality, working on my the other six perfections, insight and so on. It's still very difficult to do it. Also, one of the things which is sort of not really mentioned directly here, but indirectly, is that when we become well known or we become easy to identify, if you like, if once we put our head over the parapet, then we become a source of all sorts of criticism and so on. So in many ways, it's like it's far better, and people become jealous of us, or they want to destroy us because they feel threatened by what it is we're doing. So when somebody sees somebody who's practicing, and they're practicing with sincerity, actually working to change themselves according to the Buddha Dharma, then lots and lots of other people who are pretending to practice become very like, because essentially it means that it sort of means that what they're doing isn't legitimate. It's showing that it actually is possible still today to practice Buddha Dharma, and it makes them feel uncomfortable about themselves. So far easier, at least at an unconscious level, to find dirt on, or to make dirt on, or to create dirt on somebody in order to put them down, right? So this mind is like saying, if somebody does that to me, then for me it's far, far better to say, okay, well, I need to keep my head lower. Not to respond, not to get like um uh um to sort of say, oh, you did wrong and get furious, and not to feel too disturbed by it, not to feel disturbed by it at all if we can, but instead to think, okay, I need to just get on with my practice, never mind that. It's really, really not easy at times, I tell you, or you might know, but it's like these sorts of things we've really got to work on trying to keep our presence of mind, keep our loving kindness, keep our insight, keep our understanding, keep our practice strong. And then Jeremy Shi says, in terms of when people say things to us or show contempt or unpleasant to us, again, it's like he says this is from Shantideva, so the 6th century, is saying, since the mind isn't physical, no one can ever destroy it. So this is basically like our saying in the West, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me, right? And it's exactly the same text, same idea found in Shantideva. He says, contempt, offensive speech, and unpleasant words do not harm the body. So then why, mind, are you angry? So then Jeremiah mentioned some other lamas from Tibet, and so Sharawa, Sharawa is talking Kalumba, Nisoba, Drapa, some of these early Tibetan practitioners, and he says it didn't matter whatever they heard about them, whatever gossip they heard, whatever somebody said to them, um, they remained strong and resilient in themselves. They kept their happiness. And he said, it's so different. He says this was written. Sharma was written like 1,000 years ago. He says nowadays everybody reacts so quickly to whatever anybody says, but they take offense so easily. He says, and they become so unhappy. It's like, the good old days. The good old days then was like 200 years earlier, and now we're looking 1,200 years, and it's like, okay, oh, you dissing me, this sort of attitude, right? This sort of thing is not changed. It's still been around. It was around before even there was never really a good old days, right? So this idea of saying the only time we can work on that is by developing this resilience. And then another one was saying, so this is like really nice. This is saying like Shabdorje is a yogi, a practitioner in Tibet, and one of his assistants was saying to him, look, Geshe-la, teacher, people are saying all sorts of things. They're saying that we're lax and we're not doing our best, we're not behaving properly, and his response was, well, people talk about people. What do you expect? What else would they talk about? People talk about people. So that can really help. So then there's an objection and saying, well, when somebody has contempt for me, and they start saying all sorts of nasty things about me, other people might not like me, and I'm happy about that. It's going to put me into disrepute, and then people will avoid me, or they won't listen to me, or whatever. And it's just, I'm not happy about that. And the response to this is that, this would have some basis possibly if the other's dislike were to harm us. However, the dislike doesn't harm us at all. It doesn't give anything to us. So why on earth be unhappy about it? And essentially, there's also this point of saying that when somebody criticizes us, um, then in the end, other people will look at what they're saying and they'll look at us and they'll come to their own conclusions, right? They are just as likely to listen to us as they are to them. They're going to listen to many other people and hear all sorts of points of view. And we'll be looking at one person and think, oh, what are they known for? Oh, they're really well known for criticizing others. Yeah. What's he known for? He never criticizes anybody. So in a sense, it's like let others decide for themselves, because many do. And I think this idea of saying, oh, well, he said this and everyone else is going to think bad. It's like, well, why do you think he's so powerful, or she's so powerful? Why do you think people are going to listen to this? In the end, they probably aren't, right? So the point about it is to say, we seem to be projecting some sense of superhero ability, that everybody listens to everything they say because we are the subject of their talk. And yet it's not really like that at all. In the end, people are very able to make up their own minds about what somebody says or doesn't say. So then he says, so then there's another objection of saying, oh, what if somebody says, if they say that, then they harm me. And it's like, they prevent me from getting things. And he said, well, you can't take things with you anyways. What's the point? It's in the end, if you're going to quickly die in destitution, but with a clear mind, or you're going to die for a longer time but live improperly. What's better? I mean, if you're going to allow your mind to be completely destroyed by anger, you're going to have a miserable life. So if we're going to allow ourselves to have a miserable life but live longer, or we can have a healthy, happy life but live shorter, why would we choose to be unhappy? In general, actually, it's the other way around. Generally, in terms of our health, our well-being, our actual physical health, happiness and contentment help us because we're less stressed. When we're furious or angry, or when we're stressed, it affects our body. It affects our body, it affects our mind. And stress actually increases our unhealthiness. There's no doubt about this. So the point about this is to say, when we have a stressful mind, our brain and our body wears out faster. We are far more likely to die younger than if we are able to sustain a happy, gentle mind. So living a stress-free life is done through not being angry, right? And by not being stressed. So if we're allowing ourselves to be governed by the afflictions, especially things like fear and attachment, coarse attachment, and as a grasping mind, and a malice, then of course we're going to have a miserable time. We're going to have a physically miserable time as well. Sometimes disease comes anyway. There's nothing we can do about it. But in terms of the providing the opportunity to disease, a stressful life is much, much more easy for us to become ill. Okay. All right. So then lastly, he says, we want to stop dislike for harm doers' attainments and delight, and also to stop a delight in their troubles. So he says, for instance, this is pretty straightforward. He says essentially, now that I'm working with my spirit of enlightenment, trying to work for all sentient beings, of the benefit of their happiness, for their and so on. If I get angry at harm doers when they obtain happiness on, their own, and then I say that, and I want all beings to become Buddhas, and I get unhappy when harm doers even get even a small amount of prosperity or honor or respect, right? Um, how completely contradictory is this? How can I say I want all beings to benefit, uh, um, uh, but I'm annoyed with, I'm sort of furious that such got recognition when I know that they're harm doers. Yeah, they cause me trouble. They backstab me. I'm really unhappy that they got the recognition that I deserve, or not. And it's like this doesn't work. And again, if I want all beings to become a Buddha, and this person is like that, this doesn't work for me either. I've got to sustain this impartial compassion and loving kindness. So we've got to eliminate any jealousy we have. Recognize one of the powerful objects, opponents to jealousy, is rejoicing in the benefit of others. For me, this was very, very helpful when I was younger, when I was a teenager, in my 20s as well, is this sense of jealousy, especially with my partner. It's like, oh, I'm feeling very jealous. And then it's like, actually, I don't want to be with them if they don't want to be me. If they want to be with somebody else, then how wonderful for the time that I've had with them, right? For it's been amazing. The time I've had with them has been wonderful. The fact that they're no longer able to give me happiness, why should I give them a hard time for that? It was been wonderful while it lasted. So this sort of mind of saying, okay, actually, I don't need to be jealous, because what I've had, and what I don't get, I won't get. So it doesn't make any sense. And again, it's like saying, what I care about, if I love them, then I want them to be happy. If they find their happiness elsewhere, then that's fine. So these sorts of things of thinking about saying, actually, this idea of possession or jealousy that arises because somebody else got something that I wanted, it doesn't make any sense in any sense whatsoever. It doesn't work. For me also to be able to rejoice in and thinking, fantastic, they really, it's going to do them a huge amount of good. I'm sure they'll do well in it. This helps us to open up and feel more able to connect with them. Serves us no purpose whatsoever to be jealous. It closes our mind terribly. So again, we must also recognize we have to accept suffering. Suffering is a part of being in samsara. This is why we're where it would basically oh, sorry, I think I skipped one. Oh no, okay, yeah, I did. So then, yes, delighting in their troubles. So delighting in the troubles of those who harmed us, those who caused us harm, or that we think will cause us harm, or they just exist in a way that we don't like, and we're like, yeah, we delight in their troubles. Yeah, they got what for, right? This doesn't help us at all. Essentially, it's like saying, when this is Shantideva again. So when my enemies are unhappy, what am I pleased about? My wishes don't cause them any harm. They do no damage at all. In fact, all they do is they cause trouble for me. So it's like this idea of saying that being rejoicing in the harm of others, or feeling happy about the harm of others, lays this latent idea that harm is good, that harm is deserved, that it's right and just that they should feel harm. To rejoice in harm is about that close, it's so close to causing harm, to actually then leading to the motivation of causing harm. Because when we rejoice in harm, we legitimize harm as an action. We say it's good to cause harm. So in this idea of saying that, again, it's the same as we're feeling that somebody needs to be punished, or wanting them to be punished, or feeling a need to punish them. All of these sorts of things primarily are just undercover versions of malice. They're not anything else. They are just malice. They're just the intention to cause harm. They might not be direct, they might be indirect, but in the end, the purpose is the same. The service is the same as well. So we've got to be able to free ourselves from this. It's not possible for us to rejoice in somebody's suffering at the same time as wishing to remove them from suffering. So as soon as we enjoy or find pleasure in or feel relieved that somebody is harmed, then our compassion for them ceases at that moment. When our compassion ceases, then our impartiality has ceased. When our impartiality has ceased, we've lost great compassion. When we lose great compassion, we are rocking, or we are destroying our bodhicitta, and our bodhisattva vow becomes more hollow, right? So we're working on exactly the opposite of this sort of thing. How much have I got? Not much. So then he talks about accepting suffering. So I think we'll wait and we'll leave that until next week. Otherwise, it's going to go on and on forever. So again, we are looking at these things here primarily, and just a little summary of looking at and recognizing this idea about saying that the path to enlightenment is ostensibly is essentially the three higher trainings of ethical behavior, meditation, and insight. Right? These are the basis of all paths in Buddhahood. The six paths, the six of perfections, are made up of those three variously according to different ways. There's an increased emphasis on generosity and patience, and there's an increased emphasis on effort. Why is that? Because the path to Buddhahood is longer than any other path. The path to completely purifying ourselves of even the most tiny stains of it towards full enlightenment is the longer, this more intense path. So within the sutra tradition, it says it can take 3 ages, 3 universal ages, 3 kalpas. So this is the entire age of 3 universes for us to achieve Buddhahood. The idea then is for us to remember that it doesn't matter if it's going to take us 3 kalpas, 3 universal ages. What matters is that we stay on the path. That's the only thing that matters. In order to stay on the path, we need to make sure that we have the strength, and we have the courage, and we have the will to do that. So this strength, courage, and will primarily are provided us through this loving, powerful generosity that keeps us mindful of recognizing the love that we have for all beings, and likewise the non-essential nature of reality, so that prevents us from clinging. So this is our non-attachment point, right? Our patience provides us with our compassion for all sentient beings, and our recognition that we need to be able to face, engaged in samsara while we're remaining in samsara, to be able to engage with this armor of non-malice, right? So this is our protection against malice. These two great forces is this grasping and our malice, the two that we're working against. And just as I said about generosity, where we're looking primarily to practice in generosity in order to defeat those obstacles to our bodhicitta, both our relative and our absolute bodhicitta. Likewise, we do the same with patience, exactly the same, where we're seeing where there are faults in our patience, where we're seeing faults in our compassion, faults in our insight, in terms of the idea of objectifying or making efficacious or identifying objects of anger, right? So when we make this object of anger, he did this wrong, they did that wrong, the weather shouldn't be doing that, then this point where I'm feeling this way, then these sorts of mistakes are being made, and we need to work on those and recognize them. So practice of patience not only is providing us with an incredible resilience, this ability to engage without allowing our buttons to be pushed, but also providing us with feedback, insight into recognizing potential flaws in our practice of bodhicitta. Right, and then lastly, we haven't got there yet, but also then the addition to the basic three is effort, joyous effort, this continual, unbounded sense of joy in continuing the path, regardless of how long it goes. Yeah, so this is why we have the six perfections and why they are augment or to reinforce the three higher trainings. And the whole path is very, very beautifully and well arranged. It's not sort of it's not sort of just made up. And for us to be able to essentially come to the point where we're first of all able to understand emptiness in terms of, in a way which it doesn't conflict with anything that we've talked about in terms of karma or actions and consequences, in terms of understanding compassion and so on. And then when we understand it, being able to use our meditative strength to develop it right down into the very, very deepest parts of our mind, to the point where we can see it directly. At that point, when we see it directly, there's a non-conceptual realization which arises from our meditation state, uh, um, at which point there is nothing. It's like, in some people say, it's like a drop of water in the ocean. It just becomes a direct perception of emptiness. When this happens, when we actually have a clear, correct insight into emptiness, then we are fundamentally free from causing any trouble, causing any suffering, both to ourselves or others. And we're able to then really call ourselves bodhisattvas. But what we then do is we continue to work on that. And once we've achieved that, then we continue to work on and develop that more and more, slowly, until we're able to be free of any even the slightest stain on our mind, free from all baggage, and able to benefit spontaneously. At that point, then, we're Buddhas. There's nothing here that is sudden. Even the point where we understand a direct insight into emptiness, this isn't something that happens suddenly. It's a shift from, in terms of emphasis, from a deep meditative state to increased clarity. So there's nothing. It's all like a gentle and continual transformation into Buddhahood. Now, people say, well, there's a sudden school, Ben. What are you talking about? Sudden school means something else. It means it happens in one life. One is able to do this. And as I said before, this is done through the idea of intensity of practice. Right? All of that we're doing in Lamrim here is also likewise providing us with a framework to be able to accommodate practicing Buddha Dharma 24 hours a day, every day of our lives, right? So that's really what we're talking about in terms of intensity. Then we can actually see significant progress. It's not always easy for us to do that. Sometimes we can only do a little bit. Whatever we do is fantastic. All right, anyway, I can talk forever, you know. So any benefit, any inspiration, any sort of learning of what not to do, because I've made so many mistakes, then there's a benefit there. Maybe there's some benefit. Then all I hope for is from this is that something is of value to somebody. It's certainly of value to myself, and that I take use of it and I make use of it to become to continue to achieve or to develop my my practice as somebody who aspires towards the Bodhisattva path. So let's just lastly just have a couple of minutes of contemplation on the complete ridiculousness of allowing somebody to push our buttons. Yeah, I don't know, or just watch our mind, whichever.